When people ask us about Unitarian Universalism, we often respond by saying that ours is a creedless, literal religion. Then we might name some of our Unitarian forefathers and foremothers and their groundbreaking leadership in politics, people like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. In philosophy and literature, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman. And human rights leaders, Margaret Fuller, Susan B. Anthony, Theodore Parker. But when we're asked about the other half of our denominational name, Universalism, we often respond with a blank stare. What exactly is Universalism? If we're lucky, we might be able to summon this quip that's often used. The Universalists believe that God is too good to condemn people to hell, but the Unitarians believe they are too good for God to condemn them to hell. But beyond that one-liner, what is Universalism, and how is it part of this now Unitarian Universalist tradition? Well, for one thing, Universalism is unique. It boasts our tradition's first and only miracle. Nearly 250 years ago, September 1770, the ship Hand in Hand was en route from London to New York, and it ran aground on a sandbar off the New Jersey coast. Now, each rising tide came in, but it failed to lift that becalmed ship from the sandbar. A passenger on that ship, John Murray, joined a group that was sent ashore to find provisions for the ship. And there John Murray met a local farmer, Thomas Potter. And that meeting began a new American religion. And I'll get back to the miracle in just a moment. Well, John Murray, that passenger on the Hand in Hand, was born into a very stern, devout Calvinist family in England. That tradition's teaching instilled in the boy great fears of eternal torment in the fires of hell. As an adult, Murray discovered Methodism and became a leader in that less rigid community. But even as a Methodist, Murray's Calvinist upbringing stayed with him. He feared that he himself lacked a proper Protestant fear and trembling. He wasn't solemn enough. Murray confessed in his autobiography that his irrepressible cheerfulness seemed inconsistent with really strong religious convictions. Murray began visiting London churches, and in one he heard a preacher named James Relly, who had left Methodism to adopt a Universalist theology. Now that theology states that all humanity, not just a select few, which was the basis of Calvinist theology, that all humanity was redeemed by Christ's death, that salvation had already been achieved, and that people need only acknowledge and rejoice in the fact of their salvation. Well, Murray just enthusiastically welcomed this message of universal salvation, but he then took it back to his Methodist congregation, which was still stuck in that Calvinist tradition, and he was summarily expelled from that congregation. Now, he had worked there as a lay preacher with the Methodists, and so he lost his job, and his life began to fall apart. Unable to pay his bills, he was imprisoned for debt, and released only in time to see his infant daughter die. His wife then became ill, and debts for her medical care piled up before she too died. Murray found his eyesight failing, and he found no solace in this new Universalist religion that he had found. or in any hope for the future. So in the summer of 1770, Murray boarded the ship hand in hand, resolved to, as he wrote in his autobiography, to bury himself in the New World. But his announcement of his death was premature. Instead, it began our only Unitarian Universalist miracle. Thomas Potter, that farmer who met Murray on the New Jersey shore, was an uneducated but deeply religious man. He had built a church on his property, and he invited itinerant preachers to come and preach there. But none had brought a message that really spoke to Potter. Learning that Murray, this man who had just arrived on his shore, learning that Murray had once done some preaching, Potter asked him to deliver a sermon the following Sunday. Well, Murray at first refused. Remember, he was so depressed and stepping away from his religion and life, but finally gave in to Potter's urging, saying he would preach if the wind did not change and blow the ship off the sandbar before Sunday. The days went by that week. The wind did not change. And that Sunday, Murray delivered a sermon of universal grace, the universal salvation. The sermon that Potter had been waiting to hear. Soon after the service ended, a sailor brought news that the wind had finally changed. The ship lifted off the sandbar and prepared to sail on to New York. Well, Murray and the farmer Potter saw their chance meeting and the postponed wind change as a sign of God's providence, the only miracle in Universalist and in Unitarian history. Murray went on to preach throughout the colonies, and in 1774, just 4 years after he had landed on these shores, established America's first Universalist church in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Murray's growing church faced legal challenges regarding its right to form a dissenting, remember this was a Puritan colony, they faced these legal challenges in Massachusetts Bay Colony, where there was no separation between church and government, or church and state. All residents were required to pay taxes to support First Parish Church, Gloucester's official Puritan church. 16 of Murray's followers were suspended from First Parish Church for failure to attend the services and pay the church tax. The town seized the Universalist property, claiming they were nothing more than a gang of dissenting troublemakers. The Universalists responded to that charge, suing to be free of supporting a congregation to which they did not belong. The case dragged through the courts in the Massachusetts colony for years. And finally, 30 years later, a Massachusetts court ruled state-supported churches to be illegal. The first court mandate requiring separation of church and state in this new country. Now, opposition to the colony's tax was not the only reason the colony's civic and religious leaders attacked the Universalists. Since Murray had never been formally ordained by a denomination, First Parish Church challenged the validity of the marriages he officiated. Murray was accused by First Parish Church of being a dissenter, a false and dangerous man, driving Gloucester to the brink of ruin with his Universalist message of salvation. This message was, as they said, corrupting the morals of the youth, bringing about the total destruction of peace and harmony. After all, without the threat of hellfire, why would people, especially those easily corrupted youth, behave? Well, Murray's stalwart faith and successful challenges to Massachusetts law eventually led to legal, if reluctant, acceptance of Universalism. Its growth as an expansive, unparalleled religion followed, in many ways, the growth of an expansive, optimistic nation. By the end of the 19th century, so at the end of the 1800s, 1 in every 8 Americans called themselves Universalists. What was the appeal of the Universalist message? One famous Universalist, the showman P.T. Barnum, who I read from earlier, explained his conversion to Universalism in that pamphlet, Why I Am a Universalist. He wrote of attending as a child traditional Calvinist churches in Connecticut, where he almost felt, as he said, the burning waves and smelling the sulfurous fumes and hearing the shrieks and groans of those in hell. He realized this was not the faith for him. He was grateful to his Universalist grandfather, who acquainted him with a loving God who saves everyone. Said Barnum, I believe there is a great creator, infinite in his attributes of wisdom, power, and mercy, and that his name is love. I believe he is a God of all justice, and that he will chasten every person sufficiently to reform him in this world, not in the other world. Barnum expressed Universalist beliefs held by people for hundreds of years before John Murray brought them to America. Well, where did these beliefs come from? We need to look back to the 3rd century, the 200s CE, Common Era, when Origen, the most distinguished of the early Christian scholars and theologians, argued that the God of love, as written about in the scriptures, would not create a person knowing the person would be destined for eternal damnation. Now, Origen's teachings were declared a heresy by those early church councils, but those beliefs persisted among those who believed that anything less than universal salvation was unthinkable, since they would imply that God had failed in his creation. It was not until the late 1700s that Universalism became widespread, and it offered an alternative to Calvinism. Some of you who have read about the Great Awakening, these great revivals that swept across America in the 1700s, the 1800s, often preached a Calvinist punishment of hellfire and brimstone and frightened people. And people were saying, oh, I'd like to find something else to believe in that doesn't offer me that. So Universalism flourished because it offered a new way, a hopeful way of understanding God's salvation and eternity, and how people would spend their eternity. Universalism promised a loving God and freedom from fear of that eternal damnation. In the early 1800s, the Reverend Hosea Ballou led American Universalists in defining our denominational identity, their identity. Remembered today as the most important leader in Universalist history, Ballou was self-educated and was from rural New Hampshire. His 1805 work, A Treatise on Atonement, rejected Calvinist teachings, the teaching that human nature is fallen, that dreaded doctrine of original sin. And it also rejected the even more dreaded doctrine of that human beings are subject to eternal damnation, that dreaded doctrine of the elect and the damned. Ballou realized that the real consequences of sin were spiritual, they were internal, they were psychological, and they happened to the sinner in this life. That was his teaching. He insisted that human beings were created to be fulfilled and happy, that a loving God would not condemn humanity to eternal damnation. He said, if the Almighty, as we believe him to be, did not possess power sufficient to make all creatures happy, it was not an act of goodness to create him. Our emotions, Baloo, prompt us to moral or immoral actions, but that we can, with faith, strengthen our emotions and lead us into happiness. We cannot, said Baloo, we cannot be profitable to others unless we savor the spirit within us. The core of his Universalist message was that we have a God-given right to be happy. God is love, and when we feel this love, we are happy. Today, we Unitarian Universalists can thank Hosea Ballou for making human happiness a mandate for our liberal faith. Ballou's optimism reminds me of a Far Side cartoon. In the cartoon, two horned devils with pitchforks in hand stand in the flaming pit of hell, watching a new arrival there in hell, pushing a wheelbarrow loaded with large stones. But the man is smiling and whistling cheerfully as he pushes the wheelbarrow. One devil observes to the other, you know, we're just not reaching that guy. So that wheelbarrow pusher must have been a Universalist. Today's Unitarian Universalism is strongly influenced by the powerful Universalist history. John Murray's struggle for religious freedom and Hosea Ballou's teachings about a God of love shaped Universalism in America, a history filled with women and men who became major forces for freedom and equality in this new nation. Since the 1700s, Universalists have shared theology and values with the Unitarians, principally their understanding the role of Jesus in a Unitarian theology as opposed to the theology of Calvinism. They also stood together in their aversion to Calvinism. And they expressed these values in different ways, however. Their congregations, the Universalist congregations and the Unitarian congregations, were very different. They differed in their religious experience and also in their socioeconomic class. For the most part, the Universalists were everyday people, lived in small communities, labored on farms and in the mills, and they were unlike the intellectual Unitarians who lived in the New England cities. And for those early believers, Universalism truly proclaimed the Vision Splendid. Universalists changed our religious order in America, and they challenged the social order. They worked for religious freedom and the separation of church and state. They worked for abolition of slavery and preached equality, opening their congregations to African Americans long before other Protestant denominations did. Women were treated as equals in their early churches. Indeed, Universalists made history when they, in 1863, when they became the first denomination to ordain a woman. Olympia Brown, Reverend Olympia Brown, was, in addition to her ministry in 1863, a leading figure in women's suffrage, inspired by the writings of the amazing Judith Sargent Murray, John Murray's wife. Humanitarian work was led by women like Clara Barton, known as the Angel of the Battlefield during the Civil War and founder of the Red Cross. Other Universalists called for prison reform and end to the death penalty, which thankfully we finally have here in Washington State, thanks to the ruling of our Supreme Court. The Universalists, Mary Livermore, led men and women in the temperance movement by showing the relationship between poverty and abuse of women and children and the abuse of alcohol by husbands and fathers. Now, even the famous showman P.T. Barnum became a temperance convert. The wealthy Barnum was a bon vivant who prided himself on his very fine wine collection. But after hearing a very persuasive sermon on temperance, he went home and emptied his whole wine collection down the drain. Well, Barnum is an example of the commitment, the evangelical fervor of those 19th century Universalists. Theirs was a heart religion that softened the intellectual rationalism of Unitarianism by offering an enthusiastic affirmation of this life we are living. It affirmed the unity of our human family and of our equality before God. Now, when those two movements, Unitarianism and Universalism, merged in 1961, those values were written into Unitarian Universalism's 7 principles, especially the first, second, and 7th principles. The affirmation of the inherent worth and dignity of every person, of justice and equity and compassion in our human relations, and respect for the interdependent web of which we are part. By the early 20th century, Universalism's appeal began to decline. Those old Calvinist teachings about election and damnation to hell lost their impact on mainstream Protestants like the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Baptists. They also began to evolve from their fearsome, judgmental, and punishing God to preaching about a loving God. The liberal Unitarians and Universalists shared their theological understandings of the oneness of God and of salvation and the religious imperative of social activism. And they've been discussing possible merger of the two denominations since about 1850. Well, of course, nothing moved very quickly in religion. So it took almost 100 years before those discussions became reality in the late 1950s, when Unitarian and Universalist congregations throughout the country voted on whether they should merger. Following the affirmation by all of our congregations, the 1961 General Assembly celebrated the unifying of the two most liberal religious traditions in America. Today, we Unitarian Universalists, resolutely on the side of love, can be thankful for the heartfelt enthusiasm, the optimism that the Universalists have added to the intellectual Boston religion of the Unitarians. We need that enthusiasm, that hopefulness today more than ever. Universalists did indeed bring to our faith what the Universalist minister Clarence Skinner called the Vision Splendid, a vision of hope and promise. Skinner wrote, "I'll proclaim the Vision Splendid till it strikes God fire in old and broken hearts and urges on the world to consummate its dream. God's surrendered, and so am I. Therefore, I will live communicate with hope. I light our candles, and I dream. So may it be." And now let us sing together. Number 368. Now let us sing. I invite you to stand as you're willing and able.